Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have, of course, had a little bit of reorganisation today. For those that don't know, I think everybody knows now what happened. But for those who are watching at home, through the comfort of YouTube, we did have a problem at very short notice. Just before noon today, we were informed that the original venue for today's event was being cancelled with no particular reason given. Indeed, the original city centre venue has actually closed down for the day. So keen are they not to give us a platform that they're prepared to lose a whole day's business. Not only our business, but a whole day's business. Such is life in England in 2017. But thankfully, we were not to be closed down so easily. We had a quick plan B, and here we are, because we were not prepared to allow, especially given what today is about, the remembrance not only in particular of Mervyn Paice in this city, but the whole group of British patriots, of British soldiers, of forgotten heroes, of forgotten conscripts, of whom Mervyn Paice is a leading example. We were not prepared to allow that to go by default, that to be scrubbed out due to the cowardice of some venue manager in city centre Bristol.
Bravo, bravo.
Indeed so, and I suppose when we look on these people, when we look on these specimens of British manhood in 2017, we should look on them, as was once said, more in sorrow than in anger. That is what Britain has come to, that sort of cowardice. But we are still here. We are still going, and we will continue to do so. We aren't going to be put off by that sort of nonsense. The FBHC is, of course, dependent on collecting funds for ongoing expenses, both for future events and in particular for what is, of course, our core objective, which I'll be touching on in my speech in a short while. Our core objective, of course, remains as it was in the original rally 2 years ago, to bring the Zionist terrorist Robert Mizrahi, the man who bombed the British Colonies Club in central London in March 1947, and who is still alive in Paris to this day, unpunished, to bring that man to justice. There's no statute of limitations for terrorist crimes. Not only did this man have the audacity to come to our capital city and let off a bomb in the heart of our capital city at a club for ex-servicemen, a club for servicemen who were having their period of sort of rest and recreation in London, the British Colonies Club just off Trafalgar Square. Not only did he have the audacity to do that, but as we'll be touching on in a moment, he was part of a cell of Stern Gang bombers who were collectively responsible for one of the worst unsolved terrorist murders in British history, namely the murder of Rex Farron, the young brother of Roy Farron, who in the spring of 1948, who was blown to bits by a letter bomb sent to his home. These never let it be said that these Zionist terrorists and their ilk we should not deny them the accolade, as they would no doubt see it, of having been pioneers in the art of the letter bomb, the pioneers of the letter bomb, blowing this young man to bits just because of who his brother was. And that appalling crime, which you will see details of on the film on YouTube as well, has never been solved. The only living witness, the only living participant in that Stern Gang cell, who was sending letter bombs and putting bombs in military venues and civil service venues, is Robert Mizrahi, who has gone on untouched by the criminal law to become an illustrious academic in Paris, to become a professor of moral philosophy in Paris. Oh yes! Such is Europe post-1945. Such is the brave new world ushered in by the Second World War. That's a professor of moral philosophy.
Peter, did he go to Argentina afterwards?
He didn't have to hide out in Argentina either.
Okay.
He was welcomed with hero's garlands in Paris as a hero of the brave new world, Mr. Mizrahi. And before he shuffles off this mortal coil, I think Mr. Mizrahi ought to be brought to justice and ought to be questioned about these crimes. So we must be ready. The problem, as some of you will know, at the very start of the of the Forgotten British Heroes campaign, it was assumed that within 12 months or so we would be able to build, through letters to Scotland Yard, etc., build to a position where we were able to go to Paris and demand the arrest of this man. Unfortunately, what intervened was, of course, the terrorist atrocity in Paris, which resulted in a virtual martial law banning all forms of political demonstration. So we have been, up until now, we have been denied the right to do that. However, the present French establishment of Monsieur Macron has, I suspect, a very short shelf life, one way or another. And certainly I think we're moving towards a position where that state of emergency in Paris is likely to be lifted in the relatively near future. Therefore, we need the FBHC bank account to be replenished and healthy in order to fund what we need to do in Paris to help bring this man to justice. So I hope that at the end of today's event, people will put their hands in their pockets and donate at the back of the room. Tony will have a sack or a cap. Mr. Frank Walsh will no doubt donate his hat for the collection of funds for this purpose. Fine patriot Frank Walsh, who is with us here today. So I hope you'll be able to assist us in that respect. Now, those housekeeping announcements having been done, it falls to me in my new role as chairman to introduce the final speaker. Speaking of hats, that involves just changing hats because the final speaker is some chap called Peter Rushton. And here he is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is a government in the world today that shamelessly celebrates anti-British terrorism. A government that honours the murderers of British servicemen and indeed British civilians. This is the government of a state that owes its very existence to a brutal campaign of terrorism. A state whose leaders have for several generations been drawn from terrorists and the children of terrorists, bombers, godfathers, financiers and facilitators of terror. This is not a Muslim government, this is not a communist government, although its founders had an intricate on-off relationship with communism. This is, of course, the government of Israel, a state that demands unquestioning obeisance, a nation above criticism. In fact, to criticize this nation, to question aspects of its history and origins, is just about the only form of blasphemy that is still condemned in the 21st century. We have here today one or two people who felt the long arm of the defenders of that nation and of its founding myths. The long arm of the defenders of the founding myths. Notably, we have here today someone whose criminal case later this year will be a very important test case, as I had occasion to speak about only a month or two ago at the Southwest Forum. A very important test case in the extending of anti-free speech laws, in the extending of tyrannical laws applied in this country and across Europe. I refer, of course, to Alison Chablow, the brave singer Alison Chablow, who is here with us today. Now, on a daily basis, in our century, the main victims of Israeli tyranny are, of course, the oppressed people of Palestine. But behind the most obvious brutal oppression, behind the tanks and the cluster bombs, is another tyranny, and its victim is historical truth. Its victim is historical memory, which is why our organisation is dedicated to forgotten British heroes. And its victims are not just the victims of 70 years ago. Its victims are, in fact, all of us. And even more so, the younger generation and the coming generations. The generations who are denied access to historical truth. So on this 70th anniversary of the murders of Sergeant Mervyn Paice and Sergeant Clifford Martin, we seek to rescue that historical truth. Before referring specifically to those terrible murders that took place in July 1947, 70 years ago today, I need to give a brief background about the three main Jewish terrorist groups. Haganah, Irgun, also known as, especially to Jews, also known as Etzel, from the Hebrew initials IZL, Irgun Zvailumi, and the Stern Gang, generally known to Jews, again from its acronym as Lehi. Starting with the largest of them, and I suppose what would be regarded by mainstream historians as the most respectable of them, Haganah was in effect the armed wing of the mainstream Zionist body, the Jewish Agency. And it was Haganah that became the core of the armed forces of the new state of Israel in 1948. What became the Israeli Labour Party, the initial political establishment of that new state, that survived as its political establishment right up into the mid to late 70s. The Israeli Labour Party, people like the former President Shimon Peres, who died last year, they would want you, they would want you to believe that they were the nice guys, they were the moderates, the good guys, who dissociated themselves from the extremists in the other two groups, Irgun and Stern. It is true that in 1939, at the start of the Second World War, the Jewish Agency and its paramilitary wing Haganah took the most pro-British line, although their most powerful leader, who of course was later the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously said, "We must assist the British in the war as if there were no white paper." By white paper he meant the new policy on Jewish immigration, restricting Jewish immigration into Palestine, that had been introduced at the end of the 1930s in 1939, and which the Jews were very opposed to. So he said, we must assist the British in the war as if there were no white paper, and we must resist the white paper as if there were no war. That meant, in practice, being on Britain's side against the Germans, while at the same time attacking and undermining British policy within the Mandate of Palestine, implicitly preparing for a war against Britain as soon as the war against Germany was won. Now the other two groups, Irgun and the Stern Gang, were what in Israeli terms what would be called the supposed right wing of Israeli politics. And the Perez types, the Labour types, the establishment types, would have you believe that real terrorism was just from those two groups, Irgun and Stern Gang, whose leaders became, under various names, the political parties opposed to Labour and who have now been in government in Israel on and off since the late 70s. Now the Irgun split over the question of how far to push opposition to Britain during the war. One of the Irgun leaders, Avraham Stern, broke away from Irgun at the end of July 1940, within the first year of the Second World War. And he formed Lehi, L-E-H-I, which is a Hebrew acronym for what in English means Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. That became better known under his name as the Stern Gang, and was known under that name even after Stern himself had been shot dead by British detectives in Tel Aviv in February 1942. In those days, the good guys occasionally won. Yeah. The effective leader of the Stern Gang after Stern's death was Yitzhak Shamir, who eventually became Prime Minister of Israel during the 1980s. Ideologically, though, the Stern Gang was all over the place, prepared to do deals with anyone, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, if it would advance the anti-British cause. The main business was being anti-British for the Stern Gang. It didn't matter whether you were left, right, communist, fascist, whatever. And of course it's by referring to that aspect of the Stern Gang's history that the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, has in the last year or two got himself into so much trouble, and might yet, I think it's now starting up again, all that row, might yet be expelled from the Labour Party. But unlike the Stern Gang, the Irgun's leadership supported the anti-German war effort. Significantly, some of the Irgun terrorists, eventually under the leadership of Menachem Begin, had received specialist training from the Polish army up in the Carpathian Mountains on the borders of Poland during the late 30s, and had been supplied with Polish arms. In May 1941, on a British mission, a British organised mission inside what's now Iraq, to assassinate the Palestinian Muslim leader, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Irgun's leader, David Razil, was killed. And it was the death of David Razil on this British mission, this British assassination mission, that led to Menachem Begin, the very young Menachem Begin, becoming the leader of Irgun. So, what this meant was that by the 1970s and 1980s, you had two Israeli prime ministers drawn from what had been the most hardline anti-British terrorist groups. You had the Irgun's leader Menachem Begin as Israel's prime minister from 77 to 83, and then you had the Stern Gang's leader Yitzhak Shamir, prime minister in two spells, 83-84, and then for a longer spell, 86 to 92. Now, how did the anti-British terrorism of those two future prime ministers, how did that anti-British terrorism develop? Well, one or two incidents involving Ergon, even before the Second World War, even before they sort of temporarily reversed themselves and became Britain's allies. 2 British constables were killed in April 1938, and then 2 British detectives were killed right just literally a week or two before the start of the Second World War, in August 1939. During the war, with Ergon and Haganah on the British side for the time being, the problem group was the Stern Gang, who developed a particular fondness for armed robberies, protection rackets, and terrorist blackmail. As early as 1941, the Stern Gang had a particular notorious habit of threatening anyone who had the temerity to give evidence against them. The big turning point has been touched on earlier in today's meeting, was in November 1944. Of course, the war still underway, when Shamir's Stern Gang murdered Lord Moyne, the British government's most senior representative in the Middle East, as Minister of State in Cairo, and his driver, outside Lord Moyne's official residence in Cairo. Now, Moyne had been, was part of the Guinness family, was a former colonial secretary in the British cabinet, and he took an expert and realistic view of Zionist ambitions and their consequences for Britain. As he had told the House of Lords in June 1942, before taking up the post in Cairo, and I quote Lord Moyne's words, quote, "The Zionist claim has raised 2 burning issues. Firstly, the demand for large-scale immigration into an already overcrowded country." Interesting words. Large-scale immigration into an already overcrowded country. Yes, that rings a few bells, doesn't it? And secondly, racial domination by these newcomers over the original inhabitants.
More bells.
Yeah. And Lord Moyne continued, speaking in the House of Lords. "The Zionist movement has its main spring among those Jews of Poland and Eastern Europe. Their leaders demand that an already overcrowded Palestine should be trebled in its population by the admixture of another 3 million Jews immediately after the war. Now it is not a matter of putting a quart into a pint pot. It's a matter of putting exactly 3 pints into a pint pot," said Lord Moyne to the House of Lords. And with these words, of course, Lord Moyne made himself a target. On the day of his murder, Zionist terrorists thus showed their gratitude to Britain. On the very same day they killed Lord Moyne in Cairo, the V2s were landing on London, and British soldiers advancing across Europe were engaged in heavy fighting against German lines around Antwerp. Such was the gratitude of the Zionists. Their response, their activity in the midst of all of this was to put bullets into Lord Moyne and his driver in Cairo. And lest you think this was some passing frenzy, many years later, during negotiations with Egypt for an exchange of prisoners after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel, as part of the negotiations, made sure that to secure the return of the remains of the Stern Gang assassins who'd killed Lord Moyne and his driver. So those assassins had actually been captured and duly executed and buried in a prison cemetery in Egypt. The terrorist remains were brought back to Israel and reburied with full military honours on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, Israel's national cemetery, as it happens, adjacent to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. As the end of the Second World War approached, the Irgun brazenly warned that VE Day for Britain would be D-Day for them. Various acts of sabotage were attempted on VE Day itself. but decisive moves towards stepping up anti-British terrorism weren't triggered until October 1945, mainly because the Jewish Agency's leaders, the mainstream Zionist leaders, had hoped that a Labour government might be more favourable to Zionist objectives. In fact, strangely enough, it proved the opposite. The new Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his new Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin proved determined effectively to stick to the 1939 White Paper policy and not to abandon Palestine to Jewish domination. Ben-Gurion had discovered Labour's policy before it was even announced, because he had a highly placed spy within London's intelligence establishment. I'll have a great deal more to say about that in a few months' time. So Ben-Gurion immediately accelerated plans for a joint Hebrew resistance movement, in Hebrew Tenuat Hamari, which was an alliance of Haganah, Ergun and Lehi Stern Gang. An alliance coordinated by something called the X Committee, which had representatives of all three groups. As it happens, the most important Ergun representative on this X Committee from the end of 1945 is a man called Eitan Livni, whose daughter, Zippy Livni, became Israel's foreign minister from 2006 to 2009. And the first large-scale attacks by this joint initiative were on the 1st of November 1945, big attacks on the railway system. Now, an event of particular relevance to us here in southwest England, and to people well known to friends of ours in southwest England, was in April 1946, still at a relatively early stage in this terrorist war, as this terrorist war is starting to get wound up and wound up and wound up by this covert alliance between the so-called moderates and the so-called extremists. Because in April 1946, the Stern Gang carried out a particularly brutal attack in Tel Aviv. A school friend of one of the victims of that attack is a good friend of some people here today. Unfortunately, he's quite elderly, can't be with us today himself, but a school friend of one of the victims of that attack is still active in promoting the remembrance of these atrocities. That victim was Private Norman Knight, who was murdered just a few weeks after his 19th birthday. He'd volunteered at the very end of the Second World War, when just after his 18th birthday, had volunteered for the Parachute Regiment, qualified in May 1945, and then, rather like Eric Lowe in the film mentioned by Lady Renouf earlier on, in the film we were discussing earlier, rather like Eric Lowe, the very young Private Norman Knight was sent to Palestine. Now, this brutal attack that led to the murder of Norman Knight, the Stern Gang's objective in this attack was to steal weapons from what was at that stage a very lightly defended British guard post, effectively guarding a car park, guarding a sort of giant car park that was used for a sort of holding area for military vehicles. And the reason why at that particular stage this was an easy target for the terrorists was later explained by Major General Dare Wilson, later commander of the SAS, who was a lieutenant in charge of an airborne unit in Tel Aviv on the ground at the very spot where this happened at the time. And he has written, and I quote, "Up to this point, the stage had not yet been reached when deliberate attacks on British Army personnel were expected. Thus, the defence for this guard, in the shape of things like protective sandbag walls around the tents, gun pits for sentries, and a proper well-defended gate at the entrance, had generally not yet been adopted. These came later, together with many other additional security measures, as a result of this attack, and others which followed. And so what actually happened, in the words of this report, this telegram that was sent to various British departments describing this particular heinous attack, was sent by General Sir Alan Cunningham from Palestine to the Colonial Office on the 26th of April 1946. He describes the terrible events of the previous night. He writes, I regret to report a murderous attack carried out last night at approximately 20:45 by 20 to 30 Jewish terrorists on Airborne Division's car park in Tel Aviv. 7 British soldiers were killed. The attack began with the throwing of an anti-personnel bomb into the car park, followed by heavy bursts of fire from adjoining houses, as they prepared themselves with heavy weapons, heavy machine guns, in strategic locations across the street. Under cover of this fire, the guard tent was rushed, and 2 soldiers inside were shot dead in cold blood. In other words, being the evening, and they were literally asleep in their tents, unarmed. And these brave Jewish terrorists forced their way into the tent and just shot them where they lay. 12 rifles were stolen. 4 other soldiers were shot and killed by fire directed at the car park. 1 lance corporal was fatally wounded and died in hospital. Police personnel in the adjoining station opened fire on the attackers while retreating. All approaches to the car park, and you'll see how this relates to some of the other terrorist atrocities that we'll mention later on. All approaches to the car park were mined prior to the attack. This seriously hampered the bringing of medical assistance to the casualties. The attack was carried out apparently with the object of causing maximum bloodshed. So that was the attack in April 1946, which killed, among other people, Private Norman Knight, another man who would have been a forgotten British hero were it not for the fact that his old school friend, still living in southwest England, has regularly put advertisements in the newspaper remembering the loss of his old school friend and the heinous murder of his old school friend by Zionist terrorists in this despicable, cowardly attack in April 1946. Now, throughout this period, 45-46, the utter hypocrisy of the Jewish agency, the so-called moderates in the Jewish agency, was well known to the British authorities, because the same codebreakers department who'd read the German Enigma code during the war were also reading several codes used by the Jewish agency, Ergun and Lehi. And partly based on information from this code breaking, the British authorities attempted a crackdown on Jewish terrorism at the end of June 1946 in what was called Operation Agatha, raiding many offices, including the Jewish agency itself, and making 2,700 arrests. Now, just before, significant, the language that was used by the top British commanders in the run-up to Operation Agatha, language of a sort that if we were to use those terms today, would probably see us up in court in front of the race police. Because just in the run-up to Operation Agatha, the legendary Field Marshal Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, had taken up the top position in the British Armed Forces, known in those days as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Just taken up that position in the run-up to Operation Agatha. And he sent this message to his subordinate, the commander of Middle East Land Forces, General Sir Miles Dempsey. His message in the run-up to Operation Agatha was this, quote, "You will ensure that every officer and man in any way connected with this struggle realizes to the full the fanatical and cunning nature of his enemy, the un-English methods that this enemy will use, and his, i.e. the individual soldiers, personal responsibilities against kidnap and loss of arms and weapons. finally it must be clearly realised by all ranks that now that the Jews have flung the gauntlet in our face, they must be utterly and completely defeated, and their illegal organisation smashed forever. So said Monty. And it's a jolly good job Monty said it rather than Peter Rushton saying it, otherwise the handcuffs would be on straight away. Now, Ben-Gurion responded to this Operation Agatha, which, again, at that stage of the proceedings, did actually manage to take place with a fair element of surprise, for the most part. Ben-Gurion responded by ordering a new escalation of the joint terrorist effort, this alliance of so-called moderates and so-called extremists. Now, which is why the Irgun's bombing of the King David Hotel, one of the most notorious events of the whole period, the Irgun's bombing of the King David Hotel occurred just 3 weeks after Operation Agatha, and that wasn't a coincidence. This bombing was not, as is so often pretended by mainstream historians, it was not an outrage carried out by some extreme faction and deprecated by more moderate Jews. Far from it. This operation, though carried out by the Irgun on the ground, was deliberately instigated by the so-called moderates themselves, by the Haganah, by the Jewish Agency. The purpose, the primary aim of this bombing of the King David was, which is of course, as you will realise, as well as being a hotel, was a large part, the whole southern wing of that hotel was a British military base for British military officers and intelligence officers. So the primary aim of the bombing was to destroy some of the documents that had been seized during those Operation Agatha raids 3 weeks earlier, and which of course was stored awaiting analysis in the King David Hotel. These documents, Ben-Gurion feared, if and when analysed correctly by British intelligence, and it would take a little while for them to do it, because, as well as the arrest, we're not talking about 1 or 2 documents, we're talking about 9 tons of paperwork and documents here. Talking about a lot of stuff. But once it was properly filtered and analysed by competent British intelligence officers, Ben-Gurion feared it would strike a devastating blow against the whole Zionist campaign. And it was because of this overriding objective to destroy documents in the King David Hotel that no realistic warning was given or could be given, despite the pretense that they gave a warning. Because, of course, if they'd given time to evacuate the hotel, there might have been time to rescue at least some of the more vital documents, and that couldn't be allowed at all costs. Hence, as we know, the King David bomb went ahead, killing almost 100 people, as well as inflicting many utterly horrific injuries. You can imagine the injuries that are caused, to young women working in an office somewhere when a bomb goes off and the windows come out and there's flying glass everywhere. Even if you're not killed, the type of injuries are utterly horrific. Later in 1946, the Haganah backed away from the joint terrorist campaign because the Jewish Agency was then seeking to play a more political and diplomatic role, and was hoping that its influence with the American government would achieve a diplomatic breakthrough favourable to the Zionists, and indeed, broadly speaking, that happened. But at the same time, they were still working a sort of 2-channel operation. The Stern Gang's representative on this X-committee that I mentioned earlier, this joint committee, the Stern Gang's representative on that committee, a man called Yaakov Eliav, alias Yaakov Levstein, took the bombing campaign to a new level. Now, preparations for this had come to MI5's attention by August 1946. And For example, in this document that was sent from the joint MI5 and MI6 operation in the Middle East, sent to the intelligence wing of the Colonial Office and circulated what was meant to be circulated among the top brass in British intelligence. For some reason it got sidelined and forgotten about until it was a little bit too late to do anything about it. But the senior MI5 operative J.C. Robertson writes to the Colonial Office, he says, according to a report we've received, the Uggans-Vylumi and the Stern Group have decided to send 5 cells to London to operate in a manner similar to the IRA. To use their own words, the terrorists intend to, quote, beat the dog in his own kennel, end quote. Should the sentence of death on the 18 Stern Group members now in custody in Palestine be confirmed, the Uggans-Vylumi have agreed to come to the assistance of the Stern Group, so they would pool their resources. Also relevant to these reports is a statement made by a representative of the Palestine newspaper Haaretz on August 21st, this is 1946 again, to the effect that the Stern Group have issued an official announcement in the following terms. Quote, should the 18 members be executed, we would like to remind the British that their friends are free and their fingers on the trigger. We shall answer blood for blood. So those were the terms that were used, the unmistakable terms used by the Stern Gang at that stage. Stern Gang's bombing campaign, instigated by Eliav, included the attacks in London in March and April 1947 that we commemorated, as some of you will remember, that we commemorated at our previous FBHC events in Trafalgar Square. And this same Stern Gang cell was behind the letter bomb in May 1948 that killed Rex Farron, the young brother of the SAS war hero Roy Farron, at his family's Staffordshire home in May 1948, as I say. Scotland Yard files on that case, still unsolved, no one ever prosecuted for that heinous murder. Scotland Yard files on that case remain secret, which normally the justification for that is that the case is still open, that in theory they could still prosecute somebody, so they don't want to prejudice a future criminal case by releasing historical documents about it. Now, if the case truly remains open, ladies and gentlemen, the best lead is surely the fellow Stern Gang bomber Robert Mizrahi, who went on to become Professor of Ethical Philosophy at the Sorbonne and is still alive in Paris to this day, having evaded punishment down the decades due to the complicity of French politicians and intelligence officers with his Stern Gang masters. Now, as if all of that was bad enough, but in fact Yaakov Eliav being the boss, if you like, the commanding officer of Mizrahi, Yaakov Eliav's most evil plot is described in the Hebrew edition of his memoirs, but was edited out of the English version. Later on in 1947, a few months after this business in Trafalgar Square, Eliav acquired active cultures of cholera bacteria from Jewish contacts at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. An expert water engineer was sent to London to scout out the best method of introducing cholera into the city's water supply. And it was only because the other wing of the Zionist effort succeeded in winning United Nations backing, winning the crucial United Nations vote towards the end of 1947, that this cholera plan was abandoned. It simply wasn't necessary because they'd won anyway. It was in this context, while all these things were going on, against this background, that British intelligence officers on the ground were trying to carry out anti-terrorist operations in Palestine during 1947. And this is what led up to the murders of the two sergeants, Mervyn Paice and Clifford Martin, 70 years ago today. Because on May the 4th, 1947, an Irgun gang had blown a hole in the wall of Acre Prison, allowing 28 terrorist prisoners from Irgun and the Stern gang to escape. The main organiser of this prison breakout was actually one of the prisoners on the inside. The same man that I mentioned earlier on, the leading Irgun representative on the X-Committee, Zippy Livney's father, Eitan Livney. During the breakout, 3 Irgun operatives were captured. And even though the main breakout was successful, in the course of it all, 3 people involved in the breakout were captured. And they were sentenced to death. It was this death sentence against these 3 Irgun men that led to the kidnap and murder of Sergeants Paice and Martin. These sergeants were vulnerable to kidnap because although by this stage we're well into 1947, well into the terrorist campaign, the naivety that happened with that car park attack that I mentioned earlier in April 1946, that was long in the past. So normally, British soldiers were well aware that they were targets and wouldn't go wandering about, making themselves vulnerable. But these particular sergeants, these brave sergeants Paice and Martin, were vulnerable to kidnap because one of their jobs, one of their tasks as intelligence officers, was to pick up information on the ground from Jews in bars and shops and bazaars in Netanya, which is a city about 18 miles north of Tel Aviv. So they obviously couldn't go around, they couldn't do their job if they were travelling about in convoy surrounded by heavily armed colleagues. They had to make themselves vulnerable. And they were duly kidnapped on July the 11th in Netanya and held at a nearby diamond polishing plant, crammed into unimaginably dreadful conditions, crammed into an underground chamber with a little bit of food, very tightly packed in this underground chamber that had been specially constructed to hold just to fit 2 people with a tiny bit of space, crammed in with a little bit of food and a couple of oxygen cylinders to keep them alive, and a bucket that was emptied every few days. You can imagine these would be unpleasant conditions, even in British conditions. But remember, we're talking about Palestine in July. These particularly shocking conditions. And this wasn't just for a day or 2, this was for 18 days. During the 18 days, while Paice and Martin remained in this appalling, inhuman confinement, the Irgun and the Stern gang carried out a barrage of terrorist attacks. 8 soldiers and police were killed, more than 80 injured, in almost 70 separate attacks dotted around in the space of just 12 days.
How many were killed?
8 soldiers and police killed, more than 80 injured. And of course also a lot of damage here and there, things going off here, there and everywhere. So while the police would ideally have been wanting to concentrate on the search for Paice and Martin, there's stuff just happening everywhere, things going off. And this was almost as many attacks in less than a fortnight as had occurred during the previous 3 months combined. It's a really intense barrage of terrorist attacks, large and small. On July 29th, 70 years ago today, those 3 Irgun terrorists who'd been captured at Acre, were executed. So Menachem Begin then ordered his right-hand man, Amichai Paglin, who was been in charge of the kidnap operation, to murder Paice and Martin right away that day in retaliation. So they were duly dragged out of this tiny compartment where they'd been confined and strung up, hanged from a roof beam inside the diamond plant. Then, already dead of course, the sergeants' bodies were then driven to a nearby eucalyptus grove and strung up from trees in this eucalyptus grove. And like the following day, the Irgun notified the Jewish mayor of Netanya that the sergeants had been killed, gave him map coordinates of where the bodies could be found, and said, tomorrow morning this is where you'll find them. And they were duly discovered. about 5:30 a.m. on July the 31st. Statements written by the Irgun were pinned to the bodies, pin driven into to the chest of the bodies. A Royal Engineers captain went to cut down Sergeant Martin, Clifford Martin's body. They weren't strung up very high, by the way, because of the nature of these eucalyptus groves. They were only a few feet off the ground. But you know, a horrible sight when the fellow Britons, the fellow countrymen came and found them there. As you can imagine, in that sort of heat, they'd been dead a day and a half by then. Sergeant Martin's body fell to the ground as he was being cut down from the tree by a Royal Engineers captain. As the body hit the ground, triggered a mine, which blew up, injuring the captain, utterly destroying Sergeant Martin's body, blowing it to bits, and then uprooting the next door tree that had Sergeant Paice's body, uprooting that and blowing it some distance away. The sheer horror of this atrocity provoked anti-Jewish riots in several British cities and condemnation in very strong terms, which would be unimaginable today. The Archbishop of York said that the murders of the two sergeants, he straightforwardly said, the murders of these two sergeants were the logical outcome of the lying propaganda which had been directed against this country persistently by Zionists. And while noting the expressions of regret from the Jewish agency, the Archbishop pointed out that this dastardly crime would probably never have been committed had that same Jewish agency cooperated properly earlier in action against terrorism rather than just coming out with words about terrorism. The editorial in the Times that day was even more outspoken. The editorial in the Times on the 1st of August deserves quoting at length under the heading "Murder in Palestine." The Times wrote that it is difficult to estimate, and I'll just say that the reaction of the Times proved to be wrong in only one respect, that they actually believed that by doing something so appalling, the Jews would actually have undermined their own cause. The reason why that didn't happen, I'll touch on in my conclusion. But the Times editorial wrote, "It is difficult to estimate the damage that will be done to the Jewish cause, not only in this country but throughout the world, by the cold-blooded murder of the two British soldiers, Sergeant Martin and Sergeant Paice, after their lengthy detention by the gangsters of the Irgun-Zwilumy. The crime is presented by the criminals as the execution of sentence against members of a, quote, terrorist organisation called the British Occupation Army, end quote. In fact, though Irgun-Zwilumy have denied it, the murders were committed as a reprisal for the execution of the three terrorists condemned to death for their share in the attack on Acre prison. These three men," meaning the original terrorists who were hung, "these three men, spurred on by the strength of their own misguided convictions, knowingly took the evident risks attending their violence. They paid the extreme penalty. The case of the two British sergeants is very different. They were in Palestine," and this is where the words of the Times become truly extraordinary. "They were in Palestine, Sergeant Martin and Sergeant Paice, in the course of their military duty and in the interests of Jew and Arab alike. They belonged to the army whose sacrifices in 2 world wars made the aspirations and achievements of modern Jewry possible, and whose strength furnished the shield beneath which the national home has grown from helplessness to maturity. Now that the former services of this army are ignored by those who have most cause for gratitude, its members are displaying, in face of extreme provocation, the patience and forbearance to which the House of Commons yesterday paid tribute. None of these things was heeded by those who struck at the 2 young soldiers. They were kidnapped, unarmed and defenceless. They were murdered for no offence. As a last indignity, their bodies were employed to lure into a minefield the comrades who sought to give them Christian burial. The bestialities practiced by the Nazis themselves could go no farther, says the Times. The perpetrators chose for their crime the moment when Palestine is under the judgment of the United Nations, and when Britain cannot, even if she would, anticipate that judgment by any modification of her policy. The murder has been repudiated with horror by members of the Jewish community throughout the world. But the harm done to Jewish aspirations by this frightful culmination of the violent deeds of the Palestine terrorists will not readily be effaced.
Right.
Now, well, certainly for as long as we are here today to remember the forgotten conscripts and the forgotten heroes, it will never be effaced. That is certainly true. But the supposed horror of these other Jewish factions must, of course, be judged in the context of continuing cooperation during 1947. A definite split, a definitive split, did not in fact occur until the summer of 1948. Just a couple of very small examples here. We see a top secret report from MI6 on the 11th of February 1947, which says on the basis of their sources they knew that on the evening of his broadcast in Tel Aviv in January 47, despite them being supposedly enemies, Ben-Gurion is said to have met Menachem Begin, head of the Etzel and head of the Irgun, and expressed his confidence that he could obtain some concession from the British government on immigration. And for the sake of that particular strategy, Begin is said to have agreed to hold his hand, as the basis of the Irgun's fight was the question of Jewish immigration. And secondly, that in June 1947, just a few weeks before the kidnap and murder of the two British sergeants, the Etzel and the Stern gang had been meeting to discuss cooperation, and it was made clear, again according to this another MI6 report here, that the Irgun and the Haganah understand each other's role, and there was no possibility that they would have an open physical breach. They understand each other's role, says MI6. And of course, the reason why the real split, rather than a fake split, happened in the summer of 48 was once they'd already got the Jewish state, they had a proper falling out then, because of course it was about who was going to be in charge in that new Jewish state, and there were fallouts then that had complicated ramifications even as far as the murder of Yitzhak Rabin decades later. But in 1947 they were still just having different ways of playing the same game. So, with in the context of this statement in the Times and by many others, that surely this appalling barbarity would undermine weaken the Jewish case. Sadly, in fact, even at this very moment, in the summer of 1947, the midsummer of 1947, in practical terms, the Attlee government and the Conservative opposition had in effect already given up. They simply couldn't afford any longer to maintain the sort of troop levels in Palestine that would have been required to impose effective martial law and defeat the terrorists. And the type of measures that would have been necessary to crush Jewish terrorism would also have been, of course, opposed by the Americans, who by this time had an effective veto over anything that a British government wanted to do. Because after all, as long ago as November 1945, the Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, a genuine and determined foe of Zionist terrorism, had commented in another context, in a broader context, in Cabinet, when we were faced with stringent terms by the Americans for a renewed post-war loan, at a time when the British Empire had bankrupted itself with this utterly ruinous 6-year-long war. We were faced in November 1945 with stringent terms from the Americans. And these words I'm about to quote of Ernest Bevins were, of course, secret for many decades, but emerged in the Cabinet Secretary's private notes of this particular meeting only a year or two ago. Bevins said at that meeting in November 1945, he said to his Cabinet colleagues, "I hate the idea of getting under US control, but the situation I'm faced with is, can you carry through the British people for the next 3 years on even lower rations? I believe our bluff is called. We can't ask them," meaning the British people, "we can't ask them to face another 3 years of even tighter living with industrial unrest. We are in Shylock's hands." So said Ernest Bevin, we are in Shylock's hands. And this, of course, there's at least one person here today in the audience who lived through those years and remembers the bankruptcy of the British Empire and the suffering of ordinary British people as a result of that disastrous war. I refer, of course, to Frank Walsh, who's here with us today. So he will remember what Ernie Bevin meant when he said in November 45. It was simply asked, we can't just stand up against the Americans, simply to say, what is the lowest price we can get? And Bevin said, I'd risk a higher price if we could get it without strings, but we can't get rid of the strings. End quote. In Shylock's hands, and we can't get rid of the strings. And those strings, of course, remained ever tightening in 1947. And of course, there was also, as there always is, the enemy within. Bevin's policy was subverted on his own Labour backbenchers. An example being even in the immediate aftermath of this Netanya atrocity of the two sergeants, the reaction of the then young Manchester Jewish MP Harold Lever, later of course Lord Lever and a minister under Harold Wilson. His reaction, not so much to react against the barbarity of the treatment of the sergeants, but to condemn what he called Britain's, quote, military dictatorship in Palestine. This police state, this state of the flogging block and the gallows. Lever said, we must go, and the sooner we go, the better it will be for the people of Palestine and the people of this country. End quote. Well, we went all right, and the rest is history. The eucalyptus grove where Sergeants Martin and Paice were strung up is now part of a public park in Israel, still known to tourists and Israeli civilians as the Sergeants' Grove, advertised to tourists and local Israelis as, and I quote, a favourite destination for families. There are children's play facilities, a wooden observation tower and more. End quote. Not only did we go, but our own rulers set out to obliterate from historical memory the record of our own troops' sacrifice at the hands of this ruthless Zionist foe. And perhaps the last influential Briton to speak honestly about Palestine was John Robinson, British ambassador to Israel from 1980 to 1981, now a very little known figure whose role is only just emerging, literally only just, in the last week or two, only just emerging from the archives. A man who retired early and whose valedictory dispatch, as they call them when an ambassador retires, whose valedictory dispatch at the end of his service is still censored. Ambassador Robinson died in 1998, aged 72, but just a few days ago, a document containing some of his final comments at the start of 1981 on the Israeli situation and Britain's relationship to it was released. Back at the Foreign Office in London, his views were summarised by Oliver Miles, a senior Foreign Office official, in this document, which again was just released, I accessed literally just a few days ago, and is being quoted in public here today for the first time. Oliver Miles said of Ambassador Robinson that Mr. Robinson has considerable scepticism about the chances of a Labour government proving genuinely different from Mr. Begin, because this was in the run-up to an election in Israel in 1981. He, Ambassador Robinson, has argued in the past that the interests of the West and of peace would, in a sense, be best served by Mr. Begin remaining in power, since he, Begin, the extremist, Begin reveals in public the true nature of Israeli policies and forces the West to react accordingly, while a Labour government packages the same policies in such a way as to make them appear more reasonable than they really are. What an interesting analysis from the Foreign Office in 1981. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the last word should go to Ambassador Robinson himself, who in a document also in that same file released just a few days ago poses the question that still confronts us and still confronts Britain's leaders today. He says in this January 1981 document, Ambassador Robinson says to the Foreign Office, "Short of ruthless American pressure, I see no prospect of a Perez-led Israel accepting Palestinian self-determination, leading to a separate state, or a return to the 1967 borders with the dismantlement of settlements." He concludes, "I do not see Perez as Israel's saviour. The question for us is how to prevent Israel, US policies abetting, from pulling down the West with her." Now, there's one or two so-called nationalists in the English Defence League, the Tommy Robinsons of this world, who are eager to pose on Israeli tanks, who could do with listening to the wise words of Ambassador Robinson. That the question is whether there's anything we can do to avoid Israel continuing to pull down the rest of the West with her. The activists of Pegida, the people who resist the decline, the modern day decline of the West, instead of being cheerleaders for every Israeli atrocity, could do also with reflecting on the words of Ambassador Robinson, that our challenge is what to do to prevent Israel dragging down the rest of the West with her. And if we are to pay any fitting tribute to the young men who fought and in many cases died in Palestine from 1945 to 48, those forgotten conscripts, those forgotten heroes, those men exemplified by Sergeant Mervyn Paice, who we remember here in Bristol today. If we're to pay any suitable tribute to them, it is surely to reflect on those words of Ambassador Robinson as well. All of us here to insist that our political leaders reflect on those words. If we are to honour the memory of our own fallen, we must not allow Israel to continue dragging down Britain and the rest of the West, dragging us down morally, dragging us down economically, dragging us down militarily into a continued pit of tit-for-tat terrorism. We will stand against that dragging down into the mire of Israel, dragging us down into the mire. We'll continue to stand against that. I hope everyone in this room will stand with me, stand with Ambassador Robinson, stand in memory of Sergeants Paice and Martin and the rest of the forgotten heroes. Thank you very much.
That was tremendous and original research there. He should write a book and call it Forgotten British Heroes. Truly, a true British hero. Peter Rushton!